Great. So hi, everyone. Welcome to the bookseller event with Stuart Neville and his editor, Juliet Grames. Before we get started, like I mentioned earlier, you guys are muted, but you're in no way silenced. Feel free to use the chat function if you have any questions or if any comments throughout this whole event. And then we'll open it up to an open mic if you guys want to open up the mics later for a loose Q&A. So thank you so much for taking the time out of your day. I know it's a sort of early event. It's 1 o'clock here in New York, 6 in Belfast or near in Northern Ireland, where Stuart's zooming in from. Yeah, so let me know if you have any questions and I'll turn it over to Juliet.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming today and giving me this chance to chat with one of my favorite people, Stuart Neville. I'm so happy that we got to publish this book of Stuart's, because I've had the great privilege of editing several of his books, but it had been a few years. And so just the pleasure of dipping into his gorgeous prose with him and being transported to his really dark, horrifically gripping crime world that is also so resonant with richly developed characters and the emotional side of story that I think no one really crafts a story the way Stuart Neville does. He's one of a kind, and House of Ashes was such an incredible book to return to his oeuvre with. I am going to talk with Stuart now, assuming that you folks in the audience haven't had a chance to read the text yet. So we will try to avoid spoilers mostly, but let me tell you, you're in for a treat if you haven't had a chance to dip in. I think my colleague Stephen has hooked you up with galleys. If not, let us know, and we'd love to get you whatever you need for your store. So let me tell you a little bit, and may I also say, questions are always welcome. I'll be monitoring the chat. So as we talk, I will feed in any questions that you want to send our way. So here at Soho Press, we have had the great privilege of publishing Stuart since his debut novel, The Ghosts of Belfast, which actually we are celebrating an anniversary of this year, and we are reissuing in a gorgeous new paperback edition. I mean, The Ghosts of Belfast is at this point a household name in crime fiction. It's a book that when I'm doing presentations to librarians or booksellers, I often see other publishers comping their books to The Ghosts of Belfast. To see Stuart have this impact on the crime fiction world is, well, obviously I feel that he deserves it, and it's such an incredible book. And now with House of Ashes, we return to Northern Ireland, which is Stuart's home, also where the Belfast cycle novels take place, but with a very, very different kind of novel, a different feel. The story of the House of Ashes centers around two women. First, we have Sarah. She is a contemporary English woman who has been removed to Northern Ireland with her husband, Damien. When you meet Sarah, you know that she's had some kind of nervous episode in her recent past, and that she's trying to recover from it. But very early in the book, you understand that her marriage is not a very healthy place for her to be taking solace and mental recovery from. The other woman we meet, her name is Mary, and she is a Northern Irish woman. We actually, in fact, meet her when she's a girl, and her story is told 50 years in the past as she unfolds the secrets of the house that modern day Sarah and Damien have moved into. A very, very dark history that will end up changing both of their lives. It's a book that is so incredibly gripping, and I hate this word, I apologize, but unputdownable. You are going to have to read it basically in one sitting so that you can see this harrowing story of what happens to these two women. But it's also just a gorgeous depiction of an idyllic lifestyle of 50 years ago, of the change that has been wrought in the Northern Irish village identity, and this question, I think, more than anything, about what a woman can or is willing to do to survive, what strength a woman can find within herself. But it's we have so many fantastic comps that we can make this book to. I think if you're a reader of Stuart Neville, you're obviously going to love it. If you're interested in Ireland, you're going to love it. If you're a reader of Stephen King, you're going to find something there that's really going to tantalize and haunt you. But I've talked a lot now, Stuart. Can I ask you, I've given kind of the about the book pitch, but what is the book about to you?
I think you use the word survival there, and possibly resilience as well. It is a book about women in abusive situations, and how they survive and fight through them and come out the other side. But in that, it doesn't. There's very little focus on violence in the book, apart from when violence does come, it's hard and it's brutal. But the vast majority of the book, violence, we know violence is a part of these women's lives, but that's not the focus of the book. It's the focus is more on the relationships between the women. The women that are in the house 60 years ago with Mary, how they all relate to each other, and how Sarah and Mary in the present day form a bond over this trauma that they share. So I think if you're asking what the book is about, it probably comes down more to how these relationships develop in this kind of pressure cooker situation that they all live in.
Where did it come from? Where did the book come from for you?
It was a very slow genesis, this book, to be honest. I've been trying to figure it out from maybe 4 or 5 years ago. I think I started toying with the ideas behind it. And it was very, very loosely, the inspiration very loosely came from a real life case that happened here a few years back, where there was a house fire, and in a household where there was a history of abuse, and there was a house fire that the whole thing culminated in, and unfortunately a family died in it. And I initially started trying to figure out something to write around that, and I realized that was still quite recent history, and the people around that would still be affected by that, and I didn't want to be insensitive in going into that in itself, but I was still interested in the idea of a family that's almost an aberration of a family, if that makes sense. And the story started to develop around that, and I had there are really two stories that run parallel to each other, and I had the story set sitting around late 50s, early 60s. I had that story from the start that came along fairly early on, and the present day story then was a difficult one to try and work around that. And I had an earlier draft with an entirely different story, which was dished and then rewritten from scratch. But what I wound up with then is these two stories that kind of interleave. And what happens, and you'll read chapter set 60 years ago, and that'll throw light on something that's happening in the present, and something you read in the present will throw light on something that happened 60 years ago. And I think that the story kind of bounces back and forth between these timelines, but each one reveals more about the other, if that makes sense.
Yeah. It's really neatly crafted. Like I never would have been able to guess that they weren't completely integrated, like that they didn't inspire each other as you were writing. It's so well crafted.
Well, yeah, well, I think it took me to have one of those stories in place before I could really properly write the other, and then the two of them kind of weave around each other. And I hope by the time it reaches the conclusion that by the end of the book you see everything kind of dovetail, and kind of come together at the sort of point of resolution right at the end for both the protagonists. But yeah, it was a difficult book to write. It was a long gestation, long kind of teasing out of what the story was, and at times I kind of there is you hinted at the part of the book that might please a Stephen King fan.
Yeah.
I was kind of trying not to do that for a long time when I was trying to write the book. Then I realized it had to be there. It was part of the story. That there was this other worldly element to it as well. That this house that the book centers around had these echoes of the past in it, and they couldn't be ignored, and they were as intrinsic to the story as Sarah and Mary.
Yeah.
And the other characters are.
Well, let's go ahead and talk about that, Stuart. I want to talk about the supernatural in your writing. because this is something you and I've talked about a lot over 10 years. I'm so curious in your evolution as a writer. When you go back to the Ghost of Belfast, there is, you've introduced the paranormal into a crime fiction world, right? And these really wheelhouse, gorgeously wrought crime novels, hard-boiled procedurals that have this element of the extra in them. I think that's what made the Ghost of Belfast into the game changer that it was. Have you always been a supernatural writer? Is that always there? Have you been containing that side of you in some of your more real world fiction?
I think, yeah, I mean, every writer is a product of their reading, and I'm an 80s kid, so I, of course, grew up reading Stephen King. There's no avoiding that. So, but then it was I came to crime fiction later on, really, as an adult, and started reading like Elroy and Dennis Lehane and Megan Abbott, people like, you know, I guess the contemporary noir writers. And then when I sat down to write, I think every time I started sitting down to write, I tried to write. The first novel I ever tried to write was actually a horror novel. No, I tell a lie. The first novel I tried to write was a complete rip-off of Carl Hyacin, but we'll set that aside. But the next novel I wrote was a horror novel. But no matter how hard I tried to stick to the horror path, it kept turning into a thriller. I kept getting this kind of mystery elements coming into it as well. And then when I started trying to write a crime novel, I couldn't keep the horror aspect out of it, which is the Ghost of Belfast, really. And that's I guess became a signature thing at the time, but nobody particularly pressured me into this. But I kind of felt like I wanted to tone down then the paranormal elements as my books went on. The time we got through the Jack London books into the Serena Flanagan books, which are all kind of part of the same loose series. But by the time we got to the fourth or fifth book in, that supernatural element was pretty much gone completely. And it was a conscious decision to move away from that as the books went on. But one of the things that happened in the meantime was putting together the short story collection, The Traveller, which came out from Soho last year. And as part of that, I was going back over the stories I'd written in the past and also revisiting aspects of the Ghost of Belfast as well for the Traveller novella. And that started tapping into the supernatural element again. I kind of realized that this isn't an intrinsic part of my writing and I shouldn't maybe be trying to block it out. And that happened while this, the House of Ashes was being written, and that kind of, there was almost a kind of a casting off of restrictions. I felt with this book that I was able to go into that aspect of things. At the same time, I don't think I'd ever call it a horror novel or you might be pushed to call it a kind of a little bit of a ghost story, but I don't think it is even that. I think it is still firmly a thriller. Yeah,
for sure.
That just happens to have this other element to it.
So now that I've pressured you on your genre identity, let me pressure you on your nationalist identity here. I've heard you say that this is the most Northern Irish book that you've written. And of course, since your debut in the States, at least, is called The Ghost of Belfast, I want to ask you, what is the different Northern Irishness of those two books? What makes this book especially about Northern Ireland? And what about you as a Northern Irish writer? How do you feel about that identity?
It's something I'd kind of tried to shy away from over a couple of books. I'd written a couple of books under a pen name, back then. They were American set books, and I'd wanted to try to write something that was leaving Northern Ireland behind, writing something that was kind of free of all the baggage that comes with writing about Northern Ireland, which I did, and I kind of got that out of my system. But then a good friend of mine, John Connolly, he's often said every book you write is a reaction to the last. And in kind of pushing the Northern Ireland thing away, in the same way that I pushed the supernatural thing away, I've swung hard back to it again. And part of it is also, I've gotten a little bit bolshy about this, in that I don't know if the correct term for this is maybe regionalism. I find the difference between being published in the US and being published in the UK and Ireland, that the Irish, Northern Irish setting in the States is seen as a selling point. It's it's my USP for Soho to a large extent.
Yeah.
Whereas on this side of the Atlantic, it has been seen in the past as a minus, which is why The Ghost of Belfast was retitled as the 12 here.
Yeah.
Because there was kind of an antipathy towards stories set in Northern Ireland, largely because so much of the storytelling from Northern Ireland was about the Troubles, and it was all a bit grim.
Yeah.
And but there'd been a bit of a shift over the last few years where there were TV series like The Fall, which is a crime series, and Derry Girls, which is a comedy series. I don't know how well known that is in the States. I'm sure it's streaming there, worth seeking out. But realizing that stories could be told set in Northern Ireland that weren't driven by this civil war that we've had.
Yeah.
And so I felt maybe it's time to go back to this, and I've had this conversation with my UK publisher several times, where I've got a new publisher in the UK now, and where my previous publisher had always wanted to bury the setting. If you read the back covers of any of my books over the last few years in the UK, Northern Ireland, you had no idea it would be set in Northern Ireland at all. Even The Ghost of Belfast in the 12, Jerry Fagan is just described as a hitman and so on, and no kind of real connection to where the story is actually based. And I accepted that at the time, and I accepted the title change at the time. But as something as in the 12 years since that book came out, I've now started to push back against.
Yeah.
And starting to realize that if a book, and it has been said, it's explicitly said to me that a big bookstore in the UK won't stock my book because it's set in Northern Ireland. And I decided I'm not going to accept that anymore, because I wouldn't accept that if it was based on any other aspect of me, or you know, from religion to sexuality to race to anything else. I don't believe being set in a particular part of the United Kingdom or Ireland should preclude a book from being sold. You know, there's no other way to come at that. And that's become a real bugbear for me over the last couple of years, and that's why I've been very keen with my new publisher not to try and hide that, to use it as a selling point. This is the thing that makes the book unique. Not least of all because about a third of the book is written in a quite distinct Northern Irish dialect. Now, I said it's not. I hope it's not difficult to read. I think it reads very smoothly and is understandable. But there's a lot of language in it that is very specific to this part of the world, which I've never tended to write with an accent. I've always kind of kept the accent very neutral. But because a third of this book is specifically from Mary's point of view, she's telling the book or the story orally. And it's her accent, it's her rhythm of speech, and so on. And it's the first line from her point of view is, "Here now to tell you." And it goes on that way, and just it's her voice, and the accent is there. And there were words like, if somebody tells somebody to be quiet, "Swish now." You know, think with these phrases, and it is a very much a Northern Irish book in the sense that it's also, in fact, it's not set in Belfast. Oh, but maybe the first 4, 5, 6 books are all set in Belfast. As the books have gone on, I've moved further out of Belfast to the countryside to where actually I'm from, outside of Belfast. And the language that Mary uses in this book is the language that I grew up, is the way older people around me spoke. The actual name of the language is Ulster Scots. And it's, and I've gone full on decided to embrace that instead of trying to hide it or shy away from it.
I was hoping you would talk about that, about where you grew up, and if you're able to channel more of your childhood identity into this book than you have been into previous books.
Well, again, the Traveller, the short story collection, helped me along with this, because there were stories that because short stories are much more free kind of format, you can basically write whatever the hell you like in a short story in the way you can't so much with a novel sometimes. there are a couple of the short stories are set on the housing estate that I grew up on
Ah,
in that book, for example. And it was interesting for me to, for a lot of time, I think a lot of people outside of Northern Ireland um, kind of view it as if Belfast covers the entire surface area of the country.
yeah.
And yes, it is the biggest sort of density of population, is the city that everybody knows the name of, but there's a whole other,
Yeah.
There's 5 other counties that Belfast doesn't touch, that there's a whole range of accents and backgrounds and from very rural to small town to smaller cities. There's people outside of Belfast haven't really had much representation in fiction.
Yeah.
In terms of Northern Irish fiction.
Yeah.
And over the last few books I've been sort of getting more into that, and this book is kind of where it crystallizes.
Yeah.
And it's and I can't say I'm the first by any stretch to do this. I mean, there's plenty of writers who've done it before me, but I mean, 2 books in particular gave me the courage to do this. One was Milkman by Anna Burns, which that's a Belfast epic, but it's written with an accent.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's another book called Country by Michael Hughes, an old friend of mine, which is set around the sort of County Armagh area where I come from. And the entire book is written with the rhythms and the cadences and the choice of words that somebody from this area would use. And I loved reading that book because I was reading it, able to read it in my voice, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So reading that very much inspired that portion of this book that is written in, I call it a dialect. I don't, dialect's maybe too strong a word for it. It is certainly written with an accent.
Yeah.
And it's one I'm particularly looking forward to the audiobook for as well.
Yeah. This is fantastic news. Like all the booksellers here who, if you have Libro FM accounts for your store, and this is like something your customers are looking toward, Stuart actually secured this.
I don't know if this has this been announced. I don't know if we can say
I won't say it. I won't say it. So, but anyway, the audiobook is going to be awesome.
Yeah. There's a very well-known Northern Irish actress we've secured to do the audiobook, and she has the perfect accent for this, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what she does with it.
So Stuart, you say that plenty of authors have done this before, but this really was my first experience reading text like this, and it's so beautifully done. I think it's going to hit so well. And you reminded me as you were talking, I will say that Stuart has always been a feminist writer. This goes back to the very beginning. Everything I've ever written for you, by you, has been incredibly feminist. And I remember the first Stolen Souls, which was the 3rd book in the Belfast cycle. It has such a strong female protagonist who's really moving the story along. And but this book, House of Ashes, this is a book about women. This is, all of your narrators are women. Did that come organically, or was that a choice? Like what inspired that?
It wasn't a conscious choice. It just kind of worked out that way. Yeah. But really, I wasn't. Now, I have often in the past, I think almost always, given some chapters from the villain's point of view in a book, because I'm always interested in what the villain has to say. This book is the first book I think that actually doesn't.
Yeah.
And I think and again, it's for me as a way of not. It's a difficulty. I mean, it's you're describing it as a feminist book. I didn't make a conscious decision to write a feminist book, and I don't know if I could define it as such, because it's kind of not for me to do that.
Maybe you just live your life in a feminist way, and therefore your art product is also feminist.
My wife might argue with that on that point. I don't know, but because of the subject matter, which is about abusive households, in varying degrees, it's about women in abusive situations. I do apologize for taking a phone. Sorry, a phone caller. I didn't want to dwell on the abuse. I think that there's always a risk in crime fiction of trying to be salacious.
Yeah.
About situations that you can't really be salacious about, and or to dwell
Mm-hmm.
on the people's torment, to be almost the border on being sadistic in the writing, which I've never liked to do.
Yeah.
Although there's always violence in my books, I don't think it's sadistic, and I don't think I revel in it.
Yeah.
And in this book in particular, because there's the underlying implication of violence, and some extent sexual violence as well, that's not something I want to take a microscope to.
Right.
I was more interested in the relationships between the women.
Yeah.
And how they were getting through this.
Yeah.
So the book, that naturally then meant the book was written from women's points of view and wasn't going to dwell on the suffering. The book was about survival rather than suffering, if that makes sense.
Well, it's fantastic. You have really a panoply of richly developed female characters in this, in a fairly slender tome here, that we get all of that richness on all of those life stories. It's just very, I want to tell everyone in the audience I'm about to open up for questions, so please go ahead and put your questions in the chat. But I have a couple more things I want to ask Stuart about. So we started to talk about this, but about the Northern Irish identity, about can you put, what is the difference between this book and Ghosts of Belfast, I guess? Was Ghosts of Belfast your debut? Talk about, I'd like you to just reflect on that 12 years later, and now that we have this 100-year anniversary of Northern Ireland, what does Ghosts of Belfast mean to you?
That book was very much a reaction to the sort of year or so it was written in, where there was a huge amount of change happening in Northern Ireland. And
you were writing it in 2008, 2009?
I was writing in 2007.
Okay.
In the spring of 2007. And as I was writing it, there were negotiations going on to form a government.
Yeah.
At Stormont in Belfast, and they came up with the St Andrews Agreement.
Yeah.
This is 10 years after the Good Friday Agreement. This is happening. Yeah. And what looked like a hopeless situation that they were in, didn't look like any of these parties were going to agree and pull a government together. They finally did.
Yeah.
And this was all happening in the background while I was writing the book, and that kept shaping the book.
Yeah.
And the book is, I don't know if it's the right word, maybe a reactionary book to an extent, in that it was, I think a lot of people felt at the time a certain amount of anger in that, although we were getting peace, there was going to be some sort of peace, it was at the expense of any form of real justice. I mean, everybody accepted at the time that on all sides that was the price we're going to pay.
Yeah.
People who suffered terrible losses, people who lost loved ones and had suffered terrible injuries and so on. That suffering was going to be kind of set aside as a matter of political expediency, which we all signed up to. We voted for it in the Good Friday Agreement, but still in all, there was still an anger that the people who had profited from the violence were going to profit from the peace, and the people who suffered were going to wind up still suffering and never get a sense of their voices being heard. And I think the Ghost of Belfast is very, very much about that.
Yeah.
Reaction to that. So it is of its moment, I think, at that time. And as the books went on, the Troubles moved further into the background, as was happening in real life. Even in those few years, Belfast was changing radically as a city, normalizing, becoming a really nice European city to visit, and nice restaurants, theaters, cinemas, all these things we hadn't had before. And so that all changed. And the time I sort of stopped writing about Northern and I came back to it, I think I'm actually able to write about Northern Ireland itself as a thing that's separate from the history of violence, or political violence.
Yeah.
And although there is still some aspect of that within this book, it's not by any means what drives it. It's kind of it's kind of a side note to everything else.
Atmospheric. Yeah.
Yeah, and again, not being set in Belfast itself, being set in
Yeah.
the sort of rural Northern Ireland and outside of the city, it's a different kind of identity.
Yeah.
To that of Belfast, and the voice is different.
Yeah.
And as dark as this book is, it's not as hard edged, I think.
Yeah, it's
as the books are set in Belfast.
That's interesting. There's such different textures. I mean, I just think your character development is unparalleled, and that's the same between them, but that's really the thing that holds them together as like a Stuart Neville book. Otherwise, they're such different, incredible. I do want to say for the booksellers in the audience, if you are having trouble having your Stuart Neville fans wait until September for House of Ashes, we do have this gorgeous deluxe edition that Stuart helped us put together of The Ghosts of Belfast to celebrate this anniversary of this. I think we included, for example, there are deleted scenes at the end that were in Stuart's original text that didn't make it into print, and they're really great. And we have discussion questions, of course. We have, it's a great package, and Stephen can share the details with you if you're looking for that. I forget what the pub date is, Stephen, do you remember?
Yes, it's actually at the end of this month. So June, excuse me, June 23rd, I believe.
Yeah, so The Ghosts of Belfast in this fantastic new edition. We do also have discussion questions for House of Ashes, if that's a thing that you or your book clubs are interested in. Yeah, so are there any questions from the audience? I'm going to cap, I have only one more question for Stuart. So you have about 2 minutes to think of your questions for him after I'm done. And my question for you, Stuart, is have you been reading anything good lately that you want to tell us about?
Oh, blimey, you put me on the spot. I've had a bit of a drought of reading this last little while. Couple of recent books. We're on the topic of Northern Ireland, so a couple of Northern Irish books. I'm not sure what their US publication status is, but The Last Crossing by Brian McGilloway was today nominated for the Theakstons Award.
Yeah.
And it's Brian's a beautiful sort of lyrical writer.
Yeah.
I would say amongst the Northern Irish writers, he's probably the closest to the classic mystery writer, I would say, out of any of us. And I think if anybody likes, if you're the booksellers, if your customers like the police detective novel, not necessarily procedural, but certainly the idea that the classical detective novel, I think Brian is somebody you should be pointing towards, maybe investigating yourself. There's a book by Sharon Dempsey called Who Took Eden Mulligan.
Oh, I've heard of that.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's out in the States or if it's coming out in the States. That book got a lot of attention this year. It's again, it's a book that's not about the tropes per se, but very much about the sort of influence of the past on the present, and how the legacy of the Troubles kind of rolls on, and,
Yeah.
and the lack of justice and that kind of thing. So those two might be worth, just those two authors in general, Brian McGilloway and Sharon Dempsey. I could recommend also other Northern Irish authors: Claire Allen, Jared Brennan, Steve Kavanagh, Adrian McKenty. I'm sure you know Owen McNamee. If you get a chance to read Owen McNamee, I'm not sure how well known. Owen McNamee's been Booker nominated a couple of times. Owen is he's the prose artist out of all of us. He's been around for quite a while, but he writes these beautiful literary crime novels, but they're usually based on real life cases.
Wait, how do you spell the last name?
McNamee.
Okay, McNamee. Okay, I'll look him
Owen
up.
McNamee. So it's EOIN. Owen McNamee.
Okay.
Blue Tango, I think, is the book that people tend to.
Okay.
One,
that sounds great.
So.
Well, Stephen's unmuted our bookseller friends. Does anyone have a question for Stuart?
I think everybody looks like they're still muted to me.
Do they? Let's see. Yeah, they are. They're all muted. Well, in that case, we can adjourn now. I know that it's been, folks sure you don't want to chip? I knew. Hi there, Tom. Nice to
Hey
see
Tom,
you.
how are
Hi,
you?
Juliet. Hey, Stuart. How are you?
Long time no see.
Good to see you. Well, I don't know. I'm very curious about your new book, and I in no way fault Soho because maybe they haven't even sent them, and I joined a little late. I haven't read it. I'm quite intrigued, but maybe while everyone else thinks of their questions, I will very flippantly ask, when is a guitar going to be a murder weapon?
Who says it hasn't?
In one of your books, or I mean, it feels like a very cheap, a very, very cheap, request to dance monkey. But I mean, I can't help but notice that there's a million of them in the room, and your fondness for them.
Well, my wife has come very close on occasion. There's a really good. Have you ever seen a TV show called Taggart?
I don't think so.
Loosely based on the Liam McIlvanney books, set in Glasgow. Classic Scottish crime drama. One of the episodes, somebody gets killed with a guitar string.
No.
That's one of the closest ones.
I've heard that, or piano wire.
Yeah, piano wire, guitar string.
Yeah.
But there might be some. Oh no, I'll say nothing. I was going to say there might be some. No, I'll keep my mouth shut. Watch this space. I'll say there might be something on the horizon.
I was like, this would be the perfect time. Anyway.
I know. I think that we would all indulge in a listening party if so inclined, but.
I would too. Tom, you may even have been there when I tried to get Stuart and Jim Salas to riff on Zoom, and they were both like, well, it would be really hard with the, transatlantic and, the lag in the videos. And I think it was actually Stephen was the one who was like, no, you're not allowed to do that, Juliet, but would have been good.
Well, I guess actually I do have another question where, again, I just, I would have been delighted to read the book ahead of time. I just don't have a copy yet, but I look forward to it. But just the premise, it's funny when you say the horror elements of the Ghosts of Belfast or the 12, I almost didn't, as I read the book, I almost think I didn't fully interpret them as supernatural so much as they can almost just be hallucinatory or sort of, yeah, I mean, I guess that it's an interesting ground where I do think that there are a number of crime books that have, horror or unreliable narrator elements. And I'm curious if you think of that, or of your books, if you're consciously introducing the supernatural, or if it's just an element of the unknown, as expressed, for the author's or the reader's own interpretation.
Well, that's an interesting thing. With the Ghosts of Belfast, I deliberately kept things ambiguous. That the supernatural element could be literally a supernatural element, or it could be a manifestation of Jerry Fagan's guilt. And I kind of let the reader decide which of those, and it really brought home to me how much a reader brings of their own sort of values and view of the world to what they're reading. Because even though Ghost of Belfast at the very end does very explicitly come down on one side of that, I find that readers will not budge from their position. If a reader has decided that it's psychological, you will not budge them. If it decided it's supernatural, you will not budge them. The reader will decide for themselves. And this book is kind of the same, to be honest. It is the supernatural element that's there it is quite ambiguous. It could be seen as a psychological manifestation rather than an actual otherworldly thing. And again, I think readers, as they come to it, will make their own decision based on their own view of the world, really.
Well, forgive the decade plus since I read Ghosts of Belfast if you did explicate it at the end. I even remember the end. I remember there's fire and kind of the set piece where it is, but apparently wherever you make things black and white, I still have the ambiguity is what stuck with me in my impression of the book. So.
I have had this conversation with many people. You're so right, Stuart. I don't know any other book that does that, where people like confirmation bias of their view of the book, regardless of what the author wrote. It's fantastic.
Hello, Sly Fox. I think you're still muted, sir. Oh, there you are.
What does thran mean?
Thran, grumpy, cribbed. If somebody's thran, they're grumpy, they're irritable, they're angry. That's one of those Ulster Scots words are in there. And he says, "It'll be thran. Your man's terrible thran, so he is." Yeah, that's what thran means. An irritable person is thran. So, thank you for the question.
Well, we're at 45 minutes, so we might have to conclude, but Stuart, thank you for talking to me. And
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
it's always so much fun.
Yes,
Can you
thank
tell
you.
us, this
No.
is not fair because I didn't preface this. I didn't warn you I was going to ask you this, but can you tell us if you're working on something else?
I am working on something else. Again, set in rural Northern Ireland.
Ooh.
This time set in the closing days of World War II.
Oh.
This book is different in that it's the first book I've written, I think, since The Final Science that has a male protagonist.
Wow.
Which has because I've stuck fairly religiously a female protagonists over the last several books, but this is the first male protagonist I've written for a while. Very much about male emotional repression and psychological damage, and yeah, there's a line in the book, I don't know if I quote myself properly, where our protagonist has come back from the front injured with a debilitating injury from the war, and going back to his home village in rural Northern Ireland, meeting his best friend and wanting to hug him, but he can't, because men shake hands, hugging's for toddlers. Men don't hug, not even over the graves of their children. And it's about that. It's about this idea of constrainment and emotional constrainment, and men having to behave in a very particular way. Even though this man's come back from the war, seen terrible things, been terribly injured, and is broken in many ways, but he has to keep this solid stoic kind of front on. And that there are other elements in the story, but that's kind of one of the main themes of the book.
I can't wait.
I need to write the bloody thing though. Oh dear.
All right, Stephen, take it away.
Thank you, Juliet and Stuart, for that really incredible conversation. I'm so happy that all these booksellers were able to come out today and take time out of your busy schedules. I know it's in the middle of the afternoon for some of you, maybe it's the start of your day for others, but thank you for taking the time to hang out with us for a little bit and hear about the new book and everything. So let me know if you have any questions. You have my email, and thank you so much. We'll talk to you soon.
Can I just, before you go, can I just, one last word? I always say this at the end of my book events, but since we're all booksellers here, I do owe my career in the States to the booksellers who, when the big chain bookstores didn't really want to know, it was the independent booksellers like Mysterious Bookshop, like Murder by the Book, like Poison Pen, all these smaller bookstores that were hand selling the book. That basically gave me a career. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for your support.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. We'll talk soon.
Bye-bye. Thank you.